The new Apple Watch Series 10 is here. It has the biggest display ever. It's also the thinnest Apple Watch ever, making it even more comfortable on your wrist. And it's the fastest charging Apple Watch, getting you 8 hours of charge in just 15 minutes. Introducing the all-new Apple Watch Series 10, now available for the first time in glossy jet black aluminum. Compared to previous generation, iPhone XS or later required. Charge time and actual results will vary.
Elon Musk is one of the most powerful men in the world. A billionaire, a free speech champion, and to his critics, a far-right rabble-rouser. But for someone so public, there's one part of his life that's less well known.
So he told people that Elon Musk had put private investigators on him.
From Tortoise, this is Elon's Spies, a journey into Musk's private world. Listen wherever you get your podcasts and follow the feed to make sure you don't miss an episode.
What came down? What came down? We crashed. The other train center's down. It's down. It's down.
Smoke everywhere. People are jumping out the windows. Oh, they're jumping out the windows, I guess, because...
I believe that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center in New York.
The world is reeling from the deadliest terror attack in history.
Osama bin Laden is just one person. He is representative of networks of people.
The U.S. government is on high alert, committed to what would become a decade-long international manhunt. Every possible source, every possible effort.
I want justice.
In the aftermath of the destruction, Americans and millions the world over remain in total shock and fear. But one New Yorker had known. A lone conceptual artist by the name of Mark Lombardi had connected the dots. A full 7 years earlier.
You know, I've never really shown this computer-generated BCCI image anywhere. Well, they better censor that.
It's 1 month after 9/11. The mood in New York is tense, quiet, but paranoia seeps into every interaction. The events of September 11th are about to reshape American foreign policy forever.
None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom.
In the days immediately following the attacks, American society starts to witness the sweeping changes to U.S. national security operations that will lead to 2 devastating wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. At 945 Madison Avenue, the striking brutalist Upper East Side location of the Whitney Museum of American Art, Maxwell Anderson, the museum's then director, receives a phone call. It brings a message so significant he can still recall it in minute detail more than 20 years later.
I was sitting in an office in the 5th floor. It was a message passed to me that an agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had come into the museum and was requesting an opportunity to examine a work off-site.
That work was a drawing of celestial-like magnificence by Mark Lombardi. The drawing also visualized information explaining how George H.W. Bush used a particular bank to fund covert CIA programs, bypassing Congress. Yet alarmingly, it also connected Osama bin Laden's associates to the same bank. The bank's name was BCCI. In fact, this work was Mark's greatest achievement, completed in 2000, a month before he died, and well over a year before September 11th.
Now, many of you may remember the BCCI bank. Osama bin Laden had a number of accounts at BCCI.
A worldwide banking scandal, a tale of fraud, corruption, and international intrigue. The Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or BCCI, operated more than 400 branches in 73 countries.
This drawing by Mark Lombardi, a prophecy a year before its time, right there on the 2nd floor of the Whitney Museum. But how did he do it? driven by a righteous pursuit of the facts and a devilish insomnia? How did Mark unearth the connections that would fund the worst terror attack in history? This is The Illuminator: Art, Conspiracy, and Madness. The story of conceptual artist Mark Lombardi's rise to fame, whose brilliant genius had devastating consequences. I'm Akko Mitchell, and this is Episode 2, The Loss of Innocence.
Head held high under the Texas sun.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
12-year-old Mark Lombardi is at home in Syracuse, upstate New York, when he is shaped by the 9/11 of his time. On a small black and white TV, he watches with his family as President John F. Kennedy's coffin makes its way to Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia. The Lombardis, working-class Italian Americans, watch along with hundreds of thousands. It's the most important moment in television history.
The president's shroud for 3 days is folded smartly for presentation to Mrs. Kennedy.
Soon this sorrow becomes seared into the collective memory of Americans, a seismic event that would decades later draw close parallels to the traumatic events of September 11th. It seems the pieces of the puzzle of Mark Lombardi's life begin to fall into place that very day. Not only does Mark become fixated on politics from a young age, on the loss of innocence in American ideals, the burgeoning civil rights movement, and the Vietnam War, but he gets a taste for what it would be like to be extraordinary. Watching the Kennedy family from his modest home and the thousands of eyes on them, he glimpses what it's like to be part of something bigger than himself, to create a legacy.
All the world today knows that we are here and we are standing before the forces of power in the state of Alabama saying...
In another life, perhaps his obsession with politics and American ideals would have led him not to conceptual art, but down a wholly different path.
He was a gregarious guy. He loved people. And he loved to talk. And he would have been a wonderful political aide. And actually, with his intensity, I could see him being in politics, and he could have done that.
Mark's secret weapon, though, was never debate or ideology, but facts, evidence, truth.
So that is really where I get a buzz. That is where my energy is renewed every day, because I am able to deal with issues and information that I think have an impact on my life.
It's this single-mindedness and unshackled creativity that propels Mark so strongly down this path.
And this is my way of coping with it, of dealing with it, more or less visualizing the connections that I think have some power influence in really even daily affairs through politics and finance.
It's an artistic flair he has not yet managed to wield.
So I'm kind of getting off the track.
After a few false starts and some failures at local colleges, Mark takes his first resolute step forward and transfers to Syracuse University for art history.
I would have met Mark in September of '72 at Syracuse University for a museum studies class.
Curator and fellow student at Syracuse, Paul Schimmel.
I think Mark at that time was both interested in museums and art history. But first and foremost, I think he thought of himself as an artist.
The program is prestigious and highly sought after, notably for its link to the nearby Everson Museum of Art.
It was such a dynamic place at that time. The Yoko Ono show, and the Joan Mitchell show, and the Nam June Paik show.
All the right names for someone like Mark, searching for the same recognition and influence. When Mark graduates in 1974, at a time when the conceptual art movement is taking hold, he leaves for Houston, following droves of others searching for meaning in the thriving Tetson art community.
We were all at that age where we were taking chances.
Don Redman, a fellow artist working at the University of Houston, makes the same choice. And Don, like Mark, is a young renegade rebelling against the dark side. In this case, a rapidly accelerating oil boom.
We were demonstrating, and I can't tell you how many times I ended up in Washington, D.C. marching against the Gulf War.
But the move to Houston is also driven by an important person, a man named Jim Harithus. We'll be back after this short break.
We're supposed to learn from our own mistakes, but other people's errors can be instructive too. From efforts to control the weather that went disastrously awry, to the untimely death of the Segway boss, history is a treasure trove of mishaps and meltdowns that can teach us all. I'm Tim Harford, host of Cautionary Tales, the podcast that mines the greatest fiascos of the past for their most valuable lessons. Listen to Cautionary Tales wherever you get your podcasts.
Kroger Delivery has one mission: to deliver the freshest food right to your door. That's why our drivers are pros. Our trucks are refrigerated. And when it comes to low prices, we always deliver. With $20 off your first order of $75 or more, there's no better time to get in on the action. Mission accomplished. Restrictions apply. See site for details.
Jim Harithus was Mark's mentor, but he also happens to be a powerful and preeminent figure in the art community, a leader, a patriarch, and maverick museum director. There was a pull to Jim that his protégés know all too well. There was no question. If you'd gained Jim's admiration, you'd already won. David Ross, who would later acquire Mark's work as the director of the Whitney Museum, was also taught by Jim at Syracuse.
No one had ever met anyone like Jim. And of course, I'd met my mentor. You're lucky in life if you meet your mentor ever. And I found my mentor, someone who took me under his wing.
And Jim knew that Mark possessed something special, something out of this world.
Anyone who responded to Jim was immediately somebody like I could understand. Because if you met Jim, you were either totally turned off and you're sort of like, who's this phony motherfucker? Or you like, wow, this is the real deal. When you met Jim Harithus, you realized that you were meeting a truly authentic radical, not a student radical, but a real radical.
Jim was at once a free spirit, rejecting the mainstream art world, and with a particular knack for discovering talent.
When Jim felt something, he felt it very strongly. And it's probably one of the reasons that Mark liked him.
Jim died in 2023 at the age of 90. This relationship altered Mark's life for the better.
Because Mark was political in his own way. He wasn't a journalist, even though he used the techniques of journalistic research into these so-called conspiracies. Jim had a strong influence on Mark, the way he did on all of us. And I think Mark probably really interested Jim because of his seriousness and the seriousness of his aesthetic project, which was to reveal, not necessarily to be a witness.
Mark invited people to question structures of power, exposing corruption and conspiracy in global politics and finance without ever revealing his own point of view.
Where does your research come from now?
It's almost exclusively from paper sources. I find a book more comforting than the computer screen, the monitor. The book I can take anywhere with me.
Under Jim's guidance and mentorship, Mark can almost taste greatness. He expects his purpose to unfold in front of him, like it has for his peers already experiencing early success. Jim hires him to work as an assistant curator at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston. It's an energizing time, a melting pot for minimalism, conceptual art, and performance art, and Mark even opens 2 galleries of his own. Accounts vary for how Mark's time at the Contemporary Arts Museum ends, but Hilary Maslin, who dated Mark, heard one side of the story.
From what I understand, and I don't think I knew this from Mark, Jim fired him because Mark, I think, was in a relationship with a woman and got physically violent with her, which is not how I experienced Mark at all. But he might have, who knows what happened.
Either way, it's a shock. Mark is experiencing acute difficulties. His galleries begin failing. He starts taking part-time jobs, simple stuff like moving precious art for galleries, something to pay the bills.
I remember when Mark started having a little more, difficulty and distress.
Terrell James, a Houston abstract painter, remembers a particularly hard moment.
It was after the gallery, and then he opened another gallery on Bissonnette Street where the museums are and other galleries were, and that didn't make it. And that was difficult. I remember being at someone's house gallery and seeing Mark in a UPS deliverer brown outfit. He had a day job briefly delivering for UPS, and I was very sad about that.
Mark hides his menial work from others, ashamed, especially from people like Paul Schimmel, his peer at Syracuse University, who is coming up in the art world and succeeding where Mark seems to fall flat.
I got to do more shows and started working with artists. And Mark, I think it was less clear to him what he wanted to do.
Something simmers inside Mark, a yearning to understand not just the world, but himself. It shakes his core, disturbs his peace.
Well, this is going to sound terribly arrogant, but yes, I do think Mark was in some ways competitive with me. It was, in a way, maybe more competitive with me than it really being a competition.
But go deeper, and it's clear it wasn't just career envy. Paul had family wealth and the effortless confidence that comes from being told you're destined for success. Mark was outclassed. But worse, his own identity evaded him. He didn't just hide from others, he hid from himself. The biggest blow, however, was that Jim Herethus, his anchor to Houston and the energy behind his work, seemed to prefer Paul.
I think he was probably first and foremost jealous of the attention and affection he saw that Jim had to me. I think he was also jealous that I apparently, from the get-go, knew what I wanted to do, and he was still unclear. And it's the nature of his art in some ways.
This had a particular sting, because more than mentor, Jim had become a surrogate father to Mark.
You could tell they knew each other for so long. It was kind of like a father-son kind of friendship. He was just really, really happy to see Mark and happy to hang out.
The gap in his life that Jim Herethus once filled, Mark now replaces with an intense and uncompromising drive as a reference librarian at the Houston Public Library, along with his friend Andy Feehan.
People would come in, you looked up stuff by subject, title, or author in drawers full of cards.
Here he could bury his pain. Amongst the dusty shelves, Mark's desire for political truth would be matched with the means to channel his discoveries in art. Finally, his political desires and his artistic vision would merge with such ferocity that he would never look back.
It was almost an accident, but sometimes original things like that, they are accidents. They're not intentional.
The information he handles at the library unlocks a part of Mark that he finds deeply satisfying, that speaks to the artist and the obsessive researcher within him. The physical handling of the paper, unrestricted, free, full of possibility. The potential to, for example, unearth the financial webs that connect an upscale resort in Southern California called La Costa to both the mob and the former president, Richard Nixon. But at the library, Andy witnesses his friend's transformation from gallerist and art historian to thinker, truth seeker, and conceptual artist.
I prefer really working with paper. I can adjust in the light, I can go backward and forward with ease.
Nobody did stuff like that. Nobody.
Mark was doing something seemingly simple, benign. Xeroxing newspaper articles, hundreds of them. People coming into the library would often do it for themselves, but Mark...
He was extremely fastidious about collecting data and information, and he was right there with the newspapers.
Andy notices Mark is making 2 copies of everything. He is making his own card catalog system. All on paper, something he can hold.
I don't really enjoy sitting at a desk, being at a monitor. That keyboard is kind of in my way. I would rather have the information central than a keyboard with my eyes over here. I can sit in the car, I can take these on the plane, I can lay around in bed.
At first, he has too much information.
We had these shoe boxes full of these index cards that finally became completely unmanageable. I mean, he couldn't connect one with the other. They weren't chronological, and it was conceptually really, really awkward.
So he devises a system.
Something that's paper and tactile that I can literally in my hands sort through, rearrange, shift around.
His method underlies his most successful art.
Until it begins to make sense to me and I can then use it to accomplish this work.
And so he decided to draw diagrams, like a sentence diagram, you know? And all of a sudden, you've expanded the definition of what art is with what you've done. And that's what Mark did. His stuff was outside of anybody's notion of art.
Mark has found an outlet for his thoughts and ideas, the connections that make up the political terrain in which he's become so obsessed, driven by an internal need to prove himself, what he's worth. Mark works with a renewed frenetic energy. Thoughts racing, like 5 radio stations all playing at the same time.
I was getting into information from a number of sources, which I was beginning to get confused by. I couldn't really keep the story straight. I was losing track of various connections.
The galleries, the paintings, the museum curating, it all faded into the background as his purpose became clear. And the man we would come to know as Mark Lombardi emerged.
I mean, he always said everything that it was in his drawings was public information. It was all found in books and articles and vetted information.
It's all public information. I am just reprocessing it. I am rearranging it in a visual format that's meaningful to me.
He had a lot of book sources.
It's Mark's renegade spirit that drives him. And it's the all-consuming fixation on power and political corruption, on global conspiracies, that alienates him from others.
I think there was this sort of intensity lurking just below the surface with him.
But it turns out, even those who thought they knew Mark didn't know the true man.
The person asked me to explain a financial transaction.
Because he cut a secretive figure.
He did not introduce himself to me as an artist.
Mark wasn't just obsessed for the sake of obsession. Mark, the unsuccessful gallerist and artist, was in fact a private investigator.
I'm curious why he even went to New York. I'm assuming that he didn't have anything left in him.
Coming up on the next episode of The Illuminator.
And this is my way of coping with it, of dealing with it, of more or less visualizing the connections that I think are have some power influence in really even daily affairs through politics and finance and all this other stuff.
More rip-offs. The savings and loan scandal could cost $500 billion, but in Washington, the big question still is who gets the blame.
The Iran-Contra scandal transfixed Washington for most of 1987 and renewed a struggle as old as the Republic between the president and Congress.
Two of the biggest stories of the 80s and 90s. The savings and loans debacle when 1,000 institutions collapsed in an implosion of reckless investments.
We will not rest until the cheats and the chiselers and the charlatans spend a large chunk of their lives behind the bars of a federal prison.
The Illuminator is a production of Brazen. It's hosted by me, Akko Mitchell. Farah Halim is the showrunner and scriptwriter. Suben Kem is the reporter and associate producer. Megan Dean and Charlie Barlow are story editors. Ian Chambers is senior producer, sound designer, and composer. Claire Urbarn is the production manager. Mariangel Gonzalez is senior producer and project manager. Ryan Ho is creative director, and Julian Pradier is the cover art designer. Additional design by Andrea Klerich. Lucy Woods is head of research, and Arnav Benaikia is fact checker. Bradley Hope and Tom Wright are executive producers. Mark Lombardi interview excerpts are sourced from the Andy Mann Video Archive, courtesy of media arts organization Aurora Picture Show. Subscribe to Brazen Plus to listen to ad-free episodes. For other amazing stories, please follow us on Instagram at brazen.fm, on X at brazenfm, or go to our website, brazen.fm.